For this next section, we're going to go over some key concepts of family systems theory. So we've talked about some of the more abstract ideas or assumptions. Let's get into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff. A lot of these first couple of ideas are coming from Murray Bowen's work specifically. One of his very most influential concepts that he developed was this idea of differentiation. Now, differentiation is the degree to which an individual is emotionally connected to and also psychologically independent from others in his or her family of origin. So you have the self here, and you have the other, meaning individuals in the family. And differentiation is the degree to which you're able to maintain a unique identity within yourself while also having a close relationship with others. If you are not differentiated, or if you're poorly differentiated, then that means there's not a good, clear boundary between you and your and your family members. The consequence of not being well differentiated is that you become overly sensitive or reactive to their emotional problems. So if there's any kind of distress in the family system and you're not poorly differentiated, then you get sucked into that problem because you're not able to separate yourself emotionally from it. And this can be manifest in two forms, either through what's called enmeshment, becoming overly involved in that person's life and problems and concerns, or emotional cutoff. Both are reactive actions, reactions to being poorly differentiated. Now that might not seem very clear. If you're cutting yourself off, that means you're disconnected from the emotion, right? Well, theoretically, at least according to Bowen, if you are cutting yourself off completely from that family, it's a sign that you are hypersensitive to the emotional turmoil in the family system to the point that you can't handle it. You're not able to maintain that boundary around the self. And so rather than risking becoming enmeshed or overly involved, you simply disconnect and create distance. So differentiation does not mean being cut off from your family members. It means maintaining healthy distance. So you can still be concerned and involved with problems, helping family members find solutions to problems, but it doesn't consume you, and you're not emotionally reactive to it, not compelled emotionally to be involved. You're involved because you choose to be, not because you're so sucked into it that you can't help it. Another important concept from Bowen's work is the idea of triangulation. Now, triangulation is the relationship process involving the displacement of tension from the relationship between two people onto a third person or entity. Bowen believed that dyads, or relationships involving two people, were inherently unstable, because if one person became distressed or unhappy, then that would cause tension in the relationship and throw it out of balance. He saw triads, or relationships involving three people, as more stable because they can manage the tension. The tension between the original two people can be displaced onto a third in some way. However, it's very common for triangles formed by this displacement of tension to not be resolved. So, for example, classic example is mom and dad are fighting about something. There's some tension in mom and dad's relationship. Rather than addressing it directly, they may displace their tension onto a child and become overly critical about that child. Or, in contrast, rather than focusing on their relationship, they invest all of their energy into a child or children, and avoid dealing with their relationship with each other, focusing instead on their children. Now, relationship triangles can take lots of different shapes. Here are just a few. So I mentioned already the tension between mom and dad getting displaced onto a child. That's one common triangle. Another one would be if there's tension between mom and dad, one of the parents seeks an ally with the child. So they bring the child in as a confidant or a support to try to deal with the discomfort of having this tension in the relationship with their spouse. And this could be on the other side as well. I'm not saying that moms do this more than dads. Either parent could be doing this. Another one would be displacing the tension onto something outside of the family. So again, tension in the relationship between parents. One of the parents may become more invested in work or spend more time in recreational activities, thus avoiding this tension. It's still not resolved, but it's at least not as readily present, and the tension is allowed to subside. Now, triangles are not all bad. In fact, therapy can be viewed as a type of relationship triangle, at least when we're doing marital or family counseling. So the tension exists in the relationship to the point that they seek out a therapist to try to control or manage that tension, come up with some kind of solution. The therapist, ideally, rather than taking on that tension and becoming the displacement of it, tries to help the dyad adjust to or cope more successfully with that tension until it's minimized to the point that they're able to manage it on their own or it goes away. Triangulation within family systems takes on lots of different shapes. These are just a few, and they happen across multiple relationships. So, for example, both of these could be happening at the same time. Mom seeks out an alliance with a child to help manage her tension with the relationship, while dad invests more energy in work or other pursuits, withdrawing from the tension in his relationship with his spouse. So think about that. What are some relationship triangles that you have experienced or witnessed yourself in your families and with friends? And last of all, we have some key concepts from Minuchin's structural family therapy model. An important concept that he developed was the idea of subsystems. Subsystems are units within the family system that are defined by a specific role, characteristic, or function. For example, generation. The parent generation is a subsystem separate from the child generation or offspring generation. Sex can also be a subsystem, so the female subsystem versus the male subsystem. Responsibilities could also be subsystems, or interests. There are lots of different ways that families might be divided up into subsystems. The most common, however, is the parental subsystem, or the executive subsystem, as it's often referred to, versus the child or sibling subsystem. Closely connected to this idea of subsystems is the idea of hierarchy, that there's a power structure of subsystems within a family. So the parental subsystem has more power and influence. They are hierarchically above the child or offspring subsystem. And then another major concept from Minuchin's work was the idea of boundaries. So here we are again with boundaries. And again, so boundaries are family system rules that define who is in or out of the family and its subsystems, and which regulate the flow of information and interactions among family members and outsiders. So these are described on a spectrum from being permeable to rigid. So a family can have very loose, open boundaries where individuals within subsystems are able to kind of float back and forth between subsystems, and there's not maybe very much of a boundary around the family system itself. People come and go easily. Or families could be defined as very rigid in their boundaries, either within, between subsystems, so there's a very clear, very defined separation between parents and children, or around the family unit as well. So who is in the family and who is not in the family. Poor boundaries or very permeable boundaries between individuals often leads to enmeshment. This is similar to the idea of differentiation that we discussed earlier from the Bowenian perspective. And this is that idea that individuals are emotionally interconnected to a degree that's unhealthy, essentially. So let's look at how some of this might appear in a family. So we've got here our family with dad and mom and 4 kids. So this orange circle with the black line represents the family and its boundary. Out here is other things in the world, school, other family members, politics, so on. The family could have a very rigid boundary and not let anything in, or it could have a more permeable boundary in which information is able to flow in and out of the family system. Within the family itself, we see the structure of the family, this pretty pink line representing the division between the parental or executive subsystem and the child subsystem. And again, this boundary could either be very rigid or it could be much more permeable, depending on how the family rules are. Let's say we have a conflict between mom and dad, and mom seeks out the comfort of her oldest daughter to commiserate with how awful dad has been lately. That would be a breach of this boundary, and it would be making this boundary somewhat permeable. This child might get sucked up here a little bit to some extent, as they are given this almost caretaking role for mom, and depending on the situation, maybe even some responsibility over her siblings. You could also look at a division between family members in terms of gender, with the male subsystem being defined in contrast to the female subsystem. If this dad in particular in this family was a real, sexist, chauvinist kind of guy, maybe he, just treats his sons really well, but treats his wife and daughters very poorly. Maybe we would want to make this boundary more rigid again. And so in this family, it's kind of a boys' club where dad and the boys are superior hierarchically to mom and the women. The reverse could also be true. So those are some examples of how systems, boundaries, subsystems, hierarchy may come into play within families.